This has been a most fascinating spectrum of opinion and expertise. It's been my experience from my position as former chairman of the Joint Economic Committee and studying the economy that one of the driving forces behind America's economic growth for the last 100 years has been our access to what we would call cheap energy. That without the ability to tap into sources of energy that have been relatively cheap, we would not have achieved the rate of productivity that we've achieved. And without being the most productive nation in the world over the last 100 years, we would not have become the richest nation in the world in that period of time. Looking ahead, if you look at demographic trends, there are only 2 countries in the next 50 years who will have increasing populations among what we consider the developed or truly developing countries. And those countries will be the United States of America and India. Every other country is going to see their population decrease because their birth rate is below the replacement rate. Their populations are going to get older and they're going to get smaller. Now, our birth rate is below replacement level, but the reason we're going to keep growing is because of our immigration rate. So the American population is going to continue to grow, and the Indian population is going to continue to grow because of their birth rate, while the other nations around us are all going to shrink. And those demographic trends suggest that we're going to need energy in America and India, perhaps more than in any other place. You've talked about the availability of energy. You've talked about the cost of energy. As I say, I think we have to have, if we're going to survive in the kind of economy we want, we have to have continued access to cheap energy. So, while we have been focusing most of our conversation so far on nuclear, would each of you or any of you have a comment as to this whole question of the American economy needing to have continued access to cheap energy in order to grow, and where you think that cheap energy probably ought to come from? Okay, Mr. Rockwell.
I think the important thing is that we've, placed too much emphasis on the idea of having a broad spectrum of energy sources. And I think that for the base load that we talk about, the day in and day out meeting all of the requirements, there's nothing in the same class with nuclear. We're used to comparing things that are a few % apart, but the energy density of nuclear compared to anything non-nuclear is factors of tens of millions, which means that you're in any non-nuclear system, you're going to be using huge quantities of material that has to be gathered up, transported, processed, and waste of a similar size dealt with. And that's a tremendous burden on the Earth, and it's also a tremendous cost that you shouldn't be having to run into. And a nuclear does its job, making almost no impact on the Earth whatsoever. And I think that the idea that we should have a mix just because it's nice to have a mix, I think that the kind of prices that we're going to pay to develop wind or solar or biofuels is going to be a large, wasteful process, and you're not going to have much to show for it at the end.
Well, Mr. Rockwell, I've been in the plant in France, in Arriva, where they reprocess the spent fuel rods, and that has convinced me of the same position you have, which says we don't need yucca because we can reprocess them, and by the time they end up doing that, the physical waste is really very small. I remember asking the fellow who ran the plant, okay, when you get down to this final product where there's no more energy left and there's nothing left to do with it, what do you do with it? And he said, we store it in the green building out back. And I said, well, and I looked at the green building and I said, what do you do when the green building's full? He says, we'll build another building. There's no major underground huge activity. It's a very small kind of impact. However, the reprocessing plant itself is not cheap. And there are those who say that it is fairly heavily government subsidized in order to achieve that goal. Can you give us something about or any of you, about the economics of the reprocessing that goes on, where you take the spent fuel rods and put them back through, if you will, and get an enormous amount of energy off of them the second time, and then it ends up with small globules that you put in the green building? That's a very significant capital investment.
Yes, sir.
My own calculations is that we are going to need, if we go the direction you're outlining, we're going to need several of those scattered across the United States. How do we get there?
I think that's a very important question, and I think that there are many people who are pushing to get the reprocessing situation built and say, see, we've handled the waste problem, and that's the most important thing. I don't think that's right. I think there's no question that we can do this, but for the reasons that you're talking about, I think it's really important that we do it right. And we've stumbled in a lot of bad paths in this process. There is no hurry to get to it. We could go a long time on the once-through process. So I think that it's really important to get the right process so that it will be economical, and would take whatever time it takes to get that. I'm convinced that we can get there, but I think it would be a mistake to hurry too fast to get it and end up with a bum process. We've done that a couple of times already.